हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम शुरू करने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री का क्लास 6 का बुक। और ये सिर्फ यूपीएससी के लिए नहीं, एनसीईआरटी स्टूडेंट्स के लिए, सीबीएसई स्टूडेंट्स जो कि क्लास 6 में पढ़ रहे हैं उनके लिए भी यूज़फुल है। तो क्लास 6 का बुक है आवर पास्ट पार्ट 1। तो आज हम इसका फर्स्ट चैप्टर शुरू करेंगे। चैप्टर 1 है व्हाट, वेयर, हाउ एंड व्हेन। तो अभी हम यह शुरू करते हैं और ये शुरू होता है रसीदा's क्वेश्चन से। तो शुरू करते हैं। Rasida sat reading the newspaper. Suddenly her eyes fell on a small headline. 100 years ago. How, she wondered, could anyone know what had happened so many years ago? Finding out what happened. Yesterday, you could listen to the radio, watch television, read a newspaper. Last year, ask somebody who remembers. But what about long, long ago? Let us see how it can be done. What can we know about the past? There are several things we can find out. What people ate, the kinds of clothes they wore, the houses in which they lived. We can find out about the lives of hunters, herders, farmers, rulers, merchants, priests, craftspersons, artists, musicians, and scientists. We can also find out about the games children played, the stories they heard, the plays they saw, the songs they sang. Where did people live? Find the river Narmada on map 1, page 2. People have lived along the banks of this river for several 100,000 years. Some of the earliest people who lived here were skilled gatherers, that is, people who gathered their food. They knew about the vast wealth of plants in the surrounding forest and collected roots, fruits, and other forest produce for their food. They also hunted animals. Now find the Suleiman and Kirtihari hills to the northwest. Some of the areas where women and men first began to grow crops such as wheat and barley about 8,000 years ago are located here. People also began rearing animals like sheep, goat, and cattle and lived in villages. Locate the Garo hills to the northeast and the Vindhyas in central India. These were some of the other areas where agriculture developed. The places where rice was first grown are to the north of the Vindhyas. Trace the river Indus and its tributaries. Tributaries are smaller rivers that flow into a larger river. About 4,700 years ago, some of the earliest cities flourished on the banks of these rivers. Later, about 2,500 years ago, cities developed on the banks of the Ganga and its tributaries and along the sea coast. Locate the Ganga and its tributary called the Swan. In ancient times, the area along these rivers to the south of the Ganga was known as Magadha, now lying in the state of Bihar. Its rulers were very powerful and set up a large kingdom. Kingdoms were set up in other parts of the country as well. Throughout, people traveled from one part of the subcontinent to another. The hills and high mountains, including the Himalayas, deserts, rivers, and seas, made journeys dangerous at times, but never impossible. So, men and women moved in search of livelihood as also to escape from natural disasters like flood or droughts. Sometimes men marched in armies, conquering others' lands. Besides, merchants traveled with the caravans or ships, carrying valuable goods from place to place. And religious teachers walked from village to village, town to town, stopping to offer instruction and advice on the way. Finally, some people perhaps traveled driven by a spirit of adventure, wanting to discover new and exciting places. All this led to the sharing of ideas between people. Where do people travel nowadays? Look at map 1 once more. Hills, mountains, and seas from the natural frontiers of the subcontinent. While it was difficult to cross these frontiers, those who wanted could and did scale the mountains and crossed the seas. People from across the frontiers also came into the subcontinent and settled here. These movements of people enriched our cultural traditions. People have shared new ways of carving stones, composing music, and even cooking food over several hundred of years. Names of the land. Two of the words we often use for our country are India and Bharat. The word India comes from the Indus called Sindhu in Sanskrit. Find Iran and Greece in your atlas. The Iranians and the Greeks who came through the northwest about 2500 years ago and were familiar with the Indus called it the Hindos or the Indos, and the land to the east of the river was called India. The name Bharata was used for a group of people who lived in the northwest and who are mentioned in the Rig Veda. The earliest composition in Sanskrit dated to about 3500 years ago. Later, it was used for the country. Finding out about the past. There are several ways of finding out about the past. One is to search for and read books that were written long ago. These are called manuscripts because they were written by hand. This comes from the Latin word manu, meaning hand. These were usually written on palm leaf or on the specially prepared bark of a tree known as the birch, which grows in the Himalayas. Over the years, many manuscripts were eaten away by insects. Some were destroyed, but many have survived, often preserved in temples and monasteries. These books dealt with all kinds of subjects religious beliefs and practices, the lives of kings, medicine, and science. Besides, there were epics, poems, plays. Many of these were written in Sanskrit, others were in Prakrit, language used by ordinary people, and Tamil. We can also study inscriptions. These are writings on relatively hard surface such as stone or metal. Sometimes kings got their orders inscribed so that people could see, read, and obey them. There are other kinds of inscriptions as well, where men and women, including kings and queens, recorded what they did. For example, kings often kept records of victories in battle. Can you think of the advantage of writing on a hard surface and what could have been the difficulties? There were There were many other things that were made and used in the past. Those who study these objects are called archaeologists. The study of remains of buildings made of stone and brick, paintings, and sculpture. They also explore and excavate, dig under the surface of the earth to find tools, weapons, pots, pens, ornaments, and coins. Some of these objects may be made of stone, others of bones, baked clay, or metal. Objects that are made of hard, imperishable substances usually survive for a long time. Archaeologists also look for bones of animals, birds, and fish to find out what people ate in the past. Plant, plant remains survive far more rarely. If seeds of grain or pieces of wood have been burnt, they survive in a charred form. Do you think cloth is found frequently by archaeologists? Historians, that is, scholars who study the past, often use the word source to refer to the information found from manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeology. Once sources are found, learning about the past becomes an adventure as we reconstruct it bit by bit. So, historians and archaeologists are like detectives who use all these sources like clues to find out about our past. One past or many. Did you notice the title of this book? Our Pasts. We have used the word past in plural to draw attention to the fact that the past was different for different groups of people. For example, the lives of hoarders or farmers were different from those of kings and queens. The lives of merchants were different from those of craftspersons, and so on. Also, as it is true even today, people follow different practices and customs in different parts of the country. For example, today most people living in the Andaman Islands get their own food by fishing, hunting, and collecting forest produce. By contrast, most people living in cities depend on others for supplies of food. Differences such as these existed in the past as well. Besides, there is another kind of difference. We know a great deal about kings and the battles they fought because they kept records of their victories. Generally, ordinary people such as hunters, fishing folks, gatherers, farmers, or herders did not keep records of what they did. While archaeology helps us to find about their lives, there is much that remains unknown. What do dates mean? If somebody asks you the date, you will probably mention the day, month, and year, 2000 and something. These years are counted from the date generally assigned to the birth of Jesus Christ, the founder of Christianity. So 2000 means 2000 years after the birth of Christ. All dates before the birth of Christ are counted backwards and usually have the letters BC, before Christ, added on. In this book, we will refer to dates going back from the present using 2000 as our starting point. Letters with date. BC we have seen stands for before Christ. You will sometimes find AD before dates. This stands for two Latin words, Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord. That means Christ. So 2012 can also be written as AD 2012. Sometimes CE is used instead of AD and BCE instead of BC. The letter CE stands for Common Era and BCE stands for Before Common Era. We use these terms because the Christian era is now used in most countries of the world. In India, we began using this form of dating from about 200 years ago. And sometimes the letter BP, meaning before present, are used. Elsewhere, we have seen that inscriptions are inscribed on hard surfaces. Many of these were inscribed several hundreds of years ago. All inscriptions contain both scripts and languages. Languages which were used as well as scripts have changed over time. So, how do scholars understand what was inscribed? This can be done through a process known as decipherment. Decipherment. One of the most famous stories of decipherment comes from Egypt, a country in North America, where there were kings and queens about 5000 years ago. Rosetta is a town on the north coast of Egypt, and here an inscribed stone was found, which contained inscriptions in three different languages and scripts, Greek and two forms of Egyptian. Scholars who could read Greek figured out that the names of kings and queens were enclosed in a little frame called a ketous. They then placed the Greek and the Egyptian signs side by side and identified the sounds for which the Egyptian letters stood. As you can see, a lion stood for L and a bird for A. Once they knew what the letter stood for, they could read other inscriptions as well. तो ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज और हमारा ये चैप्टर कंप्लीट हो गया है. तो इसलिए अभी हम चैप्टर 2 शुरू करेंगे, फ्रॉम हंटिंग गैदरिंग टू ग्रोइंग फूड. तो शुरू करते हैं. Tushar's train journey. Tushar was going from Delhi to Chennai for his cousin's wedding. They were traveling by train and he had managed to squeeze into the window seat, his nose glued to the glass pane. As he watched trees and houses fly past, his uncle tapped his shoulder and said, "Do you know what that trains were first used about 150 years ago, and that people began using buses a few decades later?" Tushar wondered, when people could not travel quickly from one place to another, did they spend their entire lives wherever they were born? Not quite. The earliest people, why were they on the move? We know about the people who lived in the subcontinent as early as 2 million years ago. Today we describe them as hunter-gatherers. The name comes from the way in which they got their food. Generally, they hunted wild animals, caught fish and birds, gathered fruits, roots, nuts, seeds, leaves, stalks, and eggs. Hunter gatherers move from place to place. There are many reasons for this. First, if they had stayed at one place for a long time, they would have eaten up all the available plant and animal resources. Therefore, they would have had to go elsewhere in search of food. Second, animals move from place to place, either in search of smaller prey or, in the case of deer and wild cattle, in search of grass and leaves. That is why those who hunted them had to follow their movements. Third, plants and trees bear fruit in different seasons, so people may have moved from season to season in search of different kinds of plants. Fourth, plants, and animals need water to survive. Water is found in lakes, streams, and rivers. While many rivers and lakes are perennial with water throughout the year, others are seasonal. People living on their banks would have had to go in search of water during the dry seasons, winter and summer. How do we know about these people? Archaeologists have found some of the things hunter gatherers made and used. It is likely that people made and used tools of stone, wood, and bone, of which stone tools have survived best. Some of these stone tools were used to cut meat and bone, scrape bark from trees and hides, animal skins, chop fruits and roots. Some may have been attached to handles of bones or wood to make spears and arrows for hunting. Other tools were used to chop wood, which was used as firewood. Wood was also used to make huts and tools. Choosing a place to live in. Look at map 2 below. All the places marked with red triangles are sites from which archaeologists have found evidence of hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers lived in many more places. Only some are shown on the map. Many sites were located near sources of water such as rivers and lakes. As stone tools were important, people tried to find places where good quality stone was easily available. Rock paintings and what they tell us. Many of the caves in which these early people lived have paintings on the walls. Some of the best examples are from Madhya Pradesh and southern Uttar Pradesh. These paintings show wild animals drawn with great accuracy and skill. Sites are places where the remains of things, tools, pots, buildings, etc. were found. These were made, used, and left behind by people. These may be found on the surface of the earth, buried under the earth, or sometimes even underwater. You will learn more about different sites in later chapters. Finding out about fire. Find the Kurnool caves on map 2. Traces of ash have been found here. This suggests that people were familiar with the use of fire. Fire could have been used for many things as a source of light, to roast meat, and to scare away animals. What do we use fire for today? Names and dates. Archaeologists have given lengthy names for the time that we are studying. They call the earliest period the Paleolithic. This comes from two Greek words, paleo meaning old and lithos meaning stone. The name points to the importance of finds of stone tools. The Paleolithic period extends from 2 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. This long stretch of time is divided into lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic. This long span of time covers 99% of human history. The period when we find environmental changes, beginning about 12,000 years ago till about 10,000 years ago, is called the Mesolithic Middle Stone. Stone tools found during this period are generally tiny and are called microliths. Microliths were probably stuck onto the handles of bone or wood to make tools such as saws and sickles. At the same time, older varieties of tools continue to be in use. The next stage from about 10,000 years ago is known as the Neolithic. What do you think the term Neolithic means? We have also mentioned the names of some places. You will find the names of many more places in later chapters. Very often we use present day names of the places where people lived in the past because we do not know what they called them. A changing environment. Around 12,000 years ago, there were major changes in the climate of the world, with a shift to relatively warm conditions. In many areas, this led to the development of grasslands. This in turn led to an increase in the number of deer, antelope, goat, sheep, and cattle. That means animals that survived on grass. Those who hunted these animals now followed them, learning about their food habits and their breeding seasons. It is likely that this helped people to start thinking about herding and rearing these animals themselves. Fishing also became important. The beginning of farming and herding. This was also a time when several grain bearing grasses, including wheat, barley, and rice, grew naturally in different parts of the subcontinent. Men, women, and children probably collected these grains as food and learned where they grew and when they ripened. This may have led them to think about growing plants on their own. In this way, people became farmers. People could also attract and then tame animals by leaving food for them near their shelters. The first animal to be tamed was the wild ancestor of the dog. Later, people encouraged animals that were relatively gentle to come near the camps where they lived. These animals, such as sheep, goat, cattle, and also the pig, lived in herds and most of them ate grass. Often, people protected these animals from attacks by other wild animals. This is how they became herders. Can you think of any reason why the dog was perhaps the first animal to be tamed? Domestication is the name given to the process in which people grow plants and look after animals. Very often, plants and animals that are tended by people become different from wild plants and animals. This is because people select plants and animals for domestication. For example, they select those plants and animals that are not prone to disease. They also select plants that yield large size grain and have strong stalks, capable of bearing the weight of the ripe grain. Seeds from selected plants are preserved and sown to ensure that new plants and seeds will have the same qualities. Amongst animals, those that are relatively gentle are selected for breeding. As a result, gradually domesticated animals and plants become different from wild animals and plants. For example, the teeth and horns of wild animals are usually much larger than those of domesticated animals. Look at these two sets of teeth. Which do you think belongs to a wild pig and which to a domesticated one? Domestication was a gradual process that took place in many parts of the world. It began about 12,000 years ago. Virtually all the plant and animal produce that we use as food today is a result of domestication. Some of the earliest plants to be domesticated were wheat and barley. The earliest domesticated animals include sheep and goat. A new way of life. If you plant a seed, you will notice that it takes some time to grow. This may be for several days, weeks, months, and in some cases, years. When people began growing plants, it meant that they had to stay in the same place for a long time, looking after the plants, watering, weeding, driving away animals and birds, till the grain ripened. And then the grain had to be used carefully. Ways in which grain was used as seed, as food, as gifts stored for food. As grain had to be stored for both food and seed, people had to think of ways of storing it. In many areas, they began making large clay pots or wove baskets or dug pits into the ground. Do you think hunter gatherers would have made and used pots? Give reason for your answer. Storing animals. Animals multiply naturally. Besides, if they are looked after carefully, they provide milk, which is an important source of food and meat, whenever required. In other words, animals that are reared can be used as a store of food. Apart from food, what are the other things that could have been obtained from animals? What are animals used for today? Finding out about the first farmers and herders. Turn to map 2. You will notice a number of blue squares. Each marks a site from where archaeologists have found evidence of early farmers and herders. These are found all over the subcontinent. Some of the most important ones are in the northwest, in the present day Kashmir, and in the east and south India. 2. Find out whether these sites were settlements of farmers and herders. Scientists study evidence of plants and animal bones. One of the most exciting finds include remains of burnt grain. These may have been burnt accidentally on or on purpose. Scientists can identify these grains and so we know that a number of crops were grown in different parts of the subcontinent. They can also identify the bones of different animals. Towards a settled life. Archaeologists have found traces of huts or houses at some sites. For instance, in Burzahom in present day Kashmir, people built pit houses which were dug into the ground with steps leading into them. This may have provided shelter in cold weather. Archaeologists have also found cooking huts both inside and outside the huts, which suggests that depending on the weather, people could cook food either indoors or outdoors. Draw a pit house. Stone tools have been found from many sites as well. Many of these are different from the earlier Paleolithic tools, and that is why they are called Neolithic. These include tools that were polished to give a fine cutting edge and mortars and pestles used for grinding grain and other plant produce. Mortars and pestles are used for grinding grain even today, several thousand years later. At the same time, tools of the Paleolithic types continue to be made and used, and remember, some tools were also made of bone. Many kinds of earthen pots have also been found. These were sometimes decorated and were used for storing things. People began using pots for cooking food, especially grains like rice, wheat, and lentils, that now became an important part of the diet. Besides, they began weaving cloth using different kinds of materials, for example, cotton that could now be grown. Did things change everywhere and all at once? Not quite. In many areas, men and women still continue to hunt and gather food, and elsewhere, people adopted farming and herding slowly over several thousand years. Besides, in some cases, people tried to combine these activities doing different things during different seasons. A closer look, living and dying in Mehergarh. Find Mehergarh on map 2. This site is located in a fertile plain near the Bolan Pass, which is one of the most important routes into Iran. Mehergarh was probably one of the places where people learned to grow barley and wheat and rear sheep and goats for the first time in this area. It is one of the earliest villages that we know about. At this site, many animal bones were found. Bones of wild animals such as the deer and pig, and also bones of sheep and goats were found. Other finds at Mehergarh include remains of square or rectangular houses. Each house had four or more compartments, some of which may have been used for storage. When people die, their relatives and friends generally pay respect to them. People look after them, perhaps in belief that there is some form of life after that. Burial is one such arrangement. Several burial sites have been found at Mehergarh. In one instance, the dead person was buried with goats, which were probably meant to serve as food in the next world. Elsewhere, cave paintings in France. Find France in your atlas. The painting below is from a cave in France. This site was discovered by four school children more than 100 years ago. Paintings like this were made between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. Many of these were of animals, such as wild horses, arrows, an older wild form of cattle, bison, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, and bear, painted in bright colors. These colors were made from minerals like ochre or iron ore and charcoal. It is possible that these paintings were done on ceremonial occasions, or perhaps they were made for special rituals performed by hunters before they went in search of prey. Can you think of any other reasons? Elsewhere, a Neolithic site. Find Turkey in your atlas. One of the famous Neolithic sites, Catalhuyuk, was found in Turkey. Several things were brought from great distances. Flint from Syria, cowries from the Red Sea, cells from the Mediterranean Sea, and used in the settlement. Remember, there were no cars. Most things would have been carried on the backs of pack animals such as cattle or by people. What do you think cowries and cells would have been used for? तो ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज और ये चैप्टर यहीं पर ख़त्म होता है। तो आज हमने 2 चैप्टर कंप्लीट किए, चैप्टर 1 और चैप्टर 2। ऐसे ही डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन करने के लिए चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए, और वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। तो आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।